Hi, everybody. I'm Ted Yacucci. Thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. Well, this is a video that I've been looking forward to producing for quite a while. I've kind of shied away from the topic in the past, but I really think it's time that we explored who the actual triggermen in Dealey Plaza were. The actual men who pulled the triggers of the rifle that shot President Kennedy in Dealey Plaza. I think there are 4 or 5 shooters that we need to identify, and I think several of them are overlooked. And we'll get into those in detail in just a minute. But first, I thought we'd jump right in and look at some of the potential or possible shooters that have been identified over the years. And we'll look at what we think the probability of those folks being shooters actually are. Let's start with Officer J.D. Tippit of the Dallas Police Department. Officer Tippit was supposed to be patrolling in the Oak Cliff section when the shots in Dealey Plaza rang out at about 12:29 p.m. Dallas time. Instead, he was seen sitting in his patrol car in the Gloco station across the Houston Street Viaduct from Dealey Plaza. He was seen by 5 people that knew him personally. They were photographer Al Volkland and his wife Lou, and 3 employees of the Gloco, Tom Mullins, Emmett Hollingshead, and J.B. Shorty Lewis. After the Marcellus Street bus did not stop at the Gloco station, Officer Tippit seemed to panic. He pulled out quickly after the bus and then was seen entering the Top 10 record store where employee Luis Cortinez knew Officer Tippit and allowed him to use the phone. Officer Tippit called a number, waited for 8 or 9 rings, then put the phone down, quickly hurried out of the store and back into his patrol car. He then stopped a motorist named James Andrews on 10th Street. He didn't say a word to him, just pulled in front of him to stop him, looked in his back seat, ran back to his patrol car, and took off again. From there, he would proceed to 10th and Patton Street, where unfortunately Officer Tippit would be killed. So, Officer Tippit is one of those candidates that's fairly easy to rule out as a potential shooter in Dealey Plaza. There's almost no way he could have been anywhere, maybe on the knoll, and then headed back to his patrol car and gotten to the Gloco station. There's no way any of that could happen. So we can safely rule out J.D. Tippit as one of the trigger men. Next, we move to Mac Wallace. Wallace was a very, very close associate of President Lyndon Johnson. He also is a man who supposedly had his fingerprint found on a box in the sniper's nest on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. So does that mean that Mac Wallace was a shooter? Well, probably not. And we'll get to that in just a second, but let's talk about Wallace. Wallace and Johnson, again, were very, very close. Wallace actually began having an affair with LBJ's sister, but his sister was also having a relationship with a golf pro named John Kinzer. I won't get into the soap opera details, but Wallace ended up killing Kinzer when Kinzer tried to blackmail LBJ. Further, Wallace performed another murder for Lyndon Johnson, and that was the murder of Henry Marshall, who was asked by the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to investigate the activities of Billy Sol Estes, another very close associate of LBJ. Well, one thing led to another, and on behalf of Lyndon Johnson, Mac Wallace killed Henry Marshall. Marshall was actually found on the side of the road with 5 shots, but was said to originally have committed suicide. So we know who Wallace was. He was capable of assassination, but was he one of the triggermen in the JFK assassination? And even if the fingerprint did belong to Mac Wallace, it doesn't mean that he was a triggerman. It may mean that he surveyed the area and was part of the assassination planning. But would he have been a triggerman? Almost assuredly not. Why? Because he was so well known and he was so closely associated with Lyndon Johnson. Mac Wallace had already been accused of two murders for President Johnson. And I think the risk would have been way too much for someone as well known as Wallace to actually be a shooter in Dealey Plaza. Would he have surveyed it again? Maybe. But I think we can rule out Mac Wallace. No one else saw him anywhere around Dealey Plaza, as far as I know. So Wallace, again, I think we can safely eliminate. Next, we get to Charles Nicoletti and James Files. Charles Nicoletti was a mafia member in Chicago under Sam Giancana. James Files was a very young associate of Nicoletti. He was about 20 or 21 years old at the time of the assassination in Dallas in 1963. Were Nicoletti and Files, for that matter, were they capable of assassination? Were they capable of murder? Well, they certainly both proved that they were. So the answer to that is definitively yes. But were they members of the shooting teams in Dallas? Were they trigger men? I don't think so. I don't think that James Files' story especially holds up at all. If you listen to his story, he says they were still making decisions as late as 10:30 a.m. on the day of the assassination of where to be positioned. It makes no sense. All of those decisions were definitely made way ahead of time. Number two, he was either 20 or 21 years old. I can't remember. Would someone like that have been trusted to be the shooter on the grassy knoll and make the decision whether to fire the final shot at the President of the United States in such an important event? Again, I don't think so, again, at all. Nicoletti, is it possible he could have been in the Daltex building or somewhere else and been a shooter? Well, again, he's capable of it. He certainly was an assassin, and he certainly fits the bill. I personally don't think that he was a member of the shooting teams. I think he was there in Dallas. I do believe that. I don't think he was a shooter. I think he was involved in the mafia's end of the setup and was more of a viewer, someone who was watching the action that day rather than participating in it. So again, James Files and Charles Nicoletti, I can't rule out Nicoletti as a shooter for sure, but I would say it would be very, very unlikely. Next, let's move to Roscoe White. And I find Roscoe White an incredibly interesting character. Roscoe White joined the United States Marines and left for Japan in August of 1957. He was stationed at Atsugi, Japan, and worked on the U-2 project, very similar to Lee Oswald. As a matter of fact, he was seen in the same areas as Lee Oswald at different places. I believe it was Hawaii, Honolulu, and at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, if my memory serves. So he was seen in the same areas as Oswald, although no one ever put them together as actually knowing each other. He was a CIA contract agent. He did perform some murders for the CIA, both overseas, and he says domestically. He actually confessed that to clergy when he was on his deathbed. Well, what's really interesting is that the timing fits. Roscoe White joined the Dallas Police Department in September of 1963, so the timing was exactly right. It's also said that he had some pictures of the backyard photos of Oswald that he really shouldn't have been in possession of. And the Assassinations Committee actually commented on White's possession of those photos. What's really interesting is that Roscoe White's son, Ricky, and his wife, Geneva, both said that they found a diary and other materials belonging to Roscoe, and they found that after he had passed. And what they said was that the diary revealed that Roscoe had shot the president from behind the grassy knoll, and then he handed the 7.65 Mauser that he was using to the man standing beside him. He then hurled over the stockade fence, took some film from a military man, whirled around the fence, and then left through the parking lot. Well, it sounds like an incredible story and probably is, but because of Roscoe White's background, he's not a man that we can kind of dismiss just out of hand. Again, did he have something to do with the assassination? I think certainly the planning of the assassination. Was he a shooter? I don't think so. But somewhere down the line, if we found out that he actually was, it wouldn't surprise me greatly. So I'm saying he's not a shooter. I don't think there's quite enough evidence that he was behind the stockade fence. I think it would have been very, very dangerous because he was a Dallas police officer, so that if anyone had seen him, I think that it would have been very, very easy for the Dallas police to be involved, stated as involved in the assassination. So I don't think he would have been allowed to be one of the shooters. But again, his background makes it at least necessary that we consider him strongly. Another really interesting character was Eugene Hale Brading. Brading, who was also known as Jim Braden, and that was the name that he was using in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. He had developed a long criminal record in California. He had been arrested over 35 times by the time the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza for burglary, for bookmaking, for embezzlement, and other things. He was in Dallas and he arrived the day before the assassination. And he met with a man named Morgan Brown. Most people know that happened at the Cabana Motel in Suite 301. Later that same day, Brading visited the offices of Texas oil billionaire Haroldson Hunt, and it is believed that Jack Ruby was in the office at the same time that Brading had gone to visit Hunt. Now, we know that Jim Braden, or Eugene Hale Brading, was arrested in the Dow Tex building after the assassination. He said that he had just gone into the building to use the phone. So he was arrested for acting suspiciously. He told police he was in Dallas on oil business, and he was actually released without charge. He returned to his room at the Cabana Motel, we know now, and it was later established that Jack Ruby had visited the motel about midnight. So Eugene Hale Brading is a very, very interesting character. We know beyond doubt that he was in Dealey Plaza in the Dow Tex building. He was arrested. He said his name was Jim Braden rather than Eugene Hale Brading. But would he have been a shooter? Well, almost assuredly not. That wasn't his thing. He wasn't actually a trigger man. But was he there in maybe as a spotter or some other role in the assassination planning? Almost assuredly he was. Okay, so if those men weren't shooters, weren't trigger men in Dealey Plaza, well, who the heck was? Well, in my opinion, we have to go back 3 weeks and look where in Chicago. Because remember, President Kennedy was scheduled to be in Chicago on Saturday, November 2nd, to view the Army Air Force football game at Soldier Field. But a few days before that, the FBI received not one, but two warnings that an assassination of President Kennedy would take place in Chicago on the motorcade route. Now, a landlady in Chicago gave the Secret Service, who were investigating, a big break when she saw four Cuban-looking men with long rifles and maps of the motorcade route in a room. She reported that, and the Secret Service began tailing two of the men. They were eventually taken into custody that night. The other two men got away. And it was revealed that we don't know anything about it, if you can believe that. They supposedly, the two men, the two Cubans, were supposedly interrogated all night, but no records exist of their interrogation, and not even their names are available. And of course, the original reporting of this story was done by Edwin Black of The Independent, and just such a wonderful job that he did. That's why we have all of these details. Well, there was a second threat to Kennedy that day also, and that had to do with a gentleman named Thomas Valley, who was very, very similar to Lee Oswald and certainly would have played the patsy role if the assassination had taken place in Chicago. He had been given a job at the IPP lithoplate factory on Jackson Street, just where a very sharp turn in Kennedy's motorcade would have been made. He was being tailed, but he was never arrested until it was announced that Kennedy would not come to Chicago because the threat was too great. Two of the Latin shooters were still at large. It was reported to the press that Kennedy didn't go because the Diem brothers in South Vietnam were kidnapped and murdered on that exact day. So what had happened was the CIA, as we have explored in many videos on this channel, but the CIA had set up the kidnapping and murder of the Diem brothers, the overthrow of the government in South Vietnam, on exactly the same day that they had planned to kill Kennedy in Chicago and have a coup d'etat in our country, resulting, of course, number one, in the Vietnam War, which Kennedy, of course, had issued NASAM 263, and we would not have had that war if NASAM 263 had been listened to. So, what my point is with all this is that there were four shooters in Chicago who had been trained, who were Cuban, and they were ready to assassinate the president in Chicago. Well, why not bring them to Dallas? They were already trained, they were already anti-Castro Cuban paramilitary types, which the CIA almost assuredly had wanted to be the shooters in this assassination. Why? Because if they were killed or they were caught or they were given up somehow, then the American people would blame who? Fidel Castro for the murder, because they would have been Cuban, and the CIA and the media and all their media assets would have put out that Castro was responsible, and it had sent hit teams to kill President Kennedy, and the CIA would have gotten exactly what they wanted. So, my points with all this is that I think when we really look at who the trigger men were in Dallas, I think the first people we have to look at are those four shooters that were in Chicago on November 2nd. Why not bring them to Dallas? They're already trained, they're already ready to go, they're already highly trained assassins, almost assuredly. And again, it was exactly who the type of shooters the CIA wanted to be involved in that assassination of President Kennedy. Now, were there other people involved in the assassination than the four shooters, if indeed any of them were actually the triggermen in Dealey Plaza? Well, sure there were. There had to be, right? Because there were fake Secret Service agents, both behind the grassy knoll that stopped police and ordinary citizens when they tried to get back there, when they thought the shots had come from the knoll area. They were trying to chase the shooters behind the grassy knoll. And also there were fake Secret Service agents in the vicinity of the Texas School Book Depository. So certainly other folks were involved along with the actual triggermen. The triggermen, of course, were trying to get away. So the other teams that were the cover teams would have moved into position in order to give the triggermen time to get away, in order to also try to bottle up as much evidence as possible in the hour or two after the assassination. And remember, I said that I thought there might be five shooters. So, besides the four potential anti-Castro Cuban shooters that came from Chicago, who would have been the fifth? Well, in my opinion, I don't think it's ever been proven that French assassin Jean Sautré was not one of the shooters. Now, he was an OAS agent, which was an organization in France that was extremely right wing. They tried to kill Charles de Gaulle. They were upset that Algeria was being given its independence, and he had proven himself as just a world class assassin. Well, he entered the Dallas area on November 19th, just a few days before the assassination, and he was expelled 2 days after the assassination. So I believe that the timing was exactly right, and I don't think he would have been in the Fort Worth and Dallas areas if he had not been contracted, if he had not been brought in by the CIA to be one of the shooters in the Kennedy assassination. From what we know about Sutre, he did the following in the months of April and May of 1963. He met with Howard Hunt and Jean-Claude Perez, who was chief of an organization in a right-wing organization in Madrid. He went to New Orleans. He met with Carlos Bernier. He went to Dallas and he met with General Edwin Walker. He went to Lake Pontchartrain and supposedly helped train anti-Castro Cubans. And, he had so much contact with the anti-Castro Cuban groups during those months that I think it's very, very likely that he and the anti-Castro Cuban hit teams were all part of the actual assassination. The French didn't tell the U.S. authorities for a couple of months, but when they finally did, they said that they believe he was in Dallas in November 1963, and that he also had aliases, Rue and Mertz, last names that he used a lot. That was one of the things that was a little bit of a mix-up when the U.S. initially did the investigation. They kept coming up with different people, but they were some of Sutre's normal aliases. So I think that we need to do a whole video on this guy just to follow his activities. But I really, really believe that he was one of the shooters, perhaps from the Dow Tex building. That's kind of where I place him that day on November 22nd, 1963, along with the anti-Castro Cuban shooters that had been brought from Chicago. Thank you so much. That's, of course, just my opinion. I'm really, really interested in hearing your opinion in the comments, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.